Hi, greetings and welcome everyone. My name is Ariana Flores. I come from the United Nations University, the Institute of Environment and Human Security. Now we are going to talk about stay or go, migration in the light of rising sea level in the Marshall Islands. Around the world, countries are already experiencing the effects of climate change, and that's why we are all here, right? The recently published IPCC report stated that sea levels are rising faster and higher than previously expected. And this affects particularly low-lying islands such as the Marshall Islands. Migration can, in some cases, be a good adaptation to climate change, but as we will discuss today, it is not as straightforward or a desirable solution for everyone. So I would like to present our speakers today. Dr. Sita Shevestavi is a senior expert at United Nations University, and she's lead author of the IPCC special report. Unfortunately, she is not able to be with us now, but she's tuned, and if you have any question for her, just let me know, and we can answer all of your questions regarding this. Dr. Kees van der Heest, he's the senior migration expert at United Nations University. And Kathy Jeffnil-Kitchener, she's a climate envoy from the Republic of Marshall Islands. So I will ask now each of our participants to give an opening statement. After the statement, we'll have time for questions from the audience. So, well, let's start. Kathy, please. No, Sita. Yes, sorry. Can we go forward?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sita Shevestavi. I'm senior scientist at United Nations University and happy to be here with you today. I'm sorry I'm not here in person. My flight was cancelled, but that's maybe even good in the context of the message I am delivering today. So I have been involved in the IPCC process for the last 2 years, working as a lead author on the special report on the ocean and the cryosphere, specifically on the chapter concerned with sea level rise and the low-lying coast. The main message of our chapter is that if we do not cut emissions, sea level rise will reach an extent which is hardly manageable at the low-lying coast. Just to give you the numbers, we are talking about 1.10 meter sea level rise at the end of the century, but this can get up to 4 meters by 2300 if we do not take action. And the worst thing is that if we accept that trajectory, there is no way to assume that we will actually avoid that 4 meter sea level rise scenario. And it's probably easy to understand how threatening that will be for small low-lying islands and developing states. The difference is huge. So if we actually cut our emissions today, and if we go for an ambitious mitigation scenario, we can reduce this to a threat, sea level rise that we can actually manage. For example, with a low emission scenario in 2100, we would foresee a sea level rise around 40 centimeters, which sound much more manageable, right? So the other issue I would like to talk about are extremes, because these sea level rise numbers are just the global mean sea level rise, but what is even more threatening for the low-lying coast are the extremes. If we think about scenarios, events, storm surges, tides, which reach an extent that the low-lying coast only experience it once 100 years today, those kind of events will be hitting our coast very soon annually. And this is especially the case in the Pacific, so especially relevant for the Pacific Islands. Those are also the places where protection is not very high at the moment, and also where protection opportunities are limited. If you think about sea level rise and potential response options, of course you can build dikes and you can armor the coast, but this is hardly applicable for the huge shoreline of low-lying islands. You can live with salinity, you can adjust your agricultural production, you can adjust your lifestyle, and this is probably possible with the low emission scenario, but hardly compatible with the high emission scenario. And then finally, you could also retreat from the coast, which is surely an opportunity, a response opportunity to large countries, but not for small island developing states. And with that, I would like to close my intervention and hand over to my colleagues who can give you hands-on experience how sea level rise is impacting those islands such as the Marshall Islands. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I will go with Dr. van der Hist, please.
Thank you. So in the next few minutes, I will talk about the research we did in the Marshall Islands, where we talked with 280 people, both in the Marshall Islands and among Marshallese people who have migrated to the US. As you see in this picture, Marshall Islands is very vulnerable to sea level rise. Our colleague Zita already explained that. You can just, by looking at this picture, imagine what it means if sea level rise is 0.5 meter or more. But besides sea level rise, these islands are also very vulnerable to drought and heat. And this picture shows that climate change in the Marshall Islands is not some kind of distant future threat. It is something that is already happening today. So from talking to our respondents in the Marshall Islands, we see that they're already experiencing impacts of climate change. Like here, where you see where that salt water intrudes on the land. So at the same time, our research also found that about 1/3 of the population of the Marshall Islands have moved to the US in the past 15 to 20 years. And as part of the research, we also asked about their motivations to move. So this is both why people have moved themselves, those we interviewed in the US. Those who are still there, we asked about household members who had moved, and we also asked about their intentions to migrate in the future. One thing that came out very clearly is that people migrate for work, for education, for healthcare, for family reunions. And those are actually the same kind of reasons that lots of people migrate in other places in the world which are not that vulnerable to climate change. So climate change and environmental stress were not yet a reason that our respondents themselves cite as a reason why they currently migrate. But at the same time, the questionnaire we did in the Marshall Islands looked at, on the one hand, like to what extent are households already experiencing climatic stress and their migration rate. And we found there that there's a strong correlation, especially between migration rates and the impacts of heat and drought on people's livelihoods and their lives. So although in the discourse, climate change is not yet seen as a reason to migrate, we do see that the more climate stressed households have been migrating more. But another, actually, I think more interesting finding even of this research is that what came out very clearly is that the vast majority of people kind of resent this idea that their islands might become inhabitable in the future. So they really resist that idea, and they put much more emphasis on the possibilities there are still for mitigation and adaptation. So among the 280 people we interviewed, there was only 14.9% who actually thought that emigration would be the best option for the future. And the rest, the vast majority, had much better hopes and called on the international community and their own government to keep their islands habitable for as long as possible. So from our research, what really comes out strongly, I think, is that this narrative that has been shown in the media over the past years of a narrative of sinking islands. And these are Newsweek, New York Times, big newspapers talking about sinking islands and also about climate refugees. So when we actually talk with people in the Marshall Islands, there's a whole different discourse about rather calling to the international community to support on keeping their islands as habitable as long as possible. And they also emphasize that they themselves are working on that. So I think from our research, what the key message is that it's like a time for a new narrative, not sinking islands, not climate refugees, because this could rather be damaging, because when this is said over and over again, the sort of incentive and hope for adaptation reduces. So with that, I would like to hand over to Kathy, who is even in a much better position than me to talk about the Marshall Islands, because she's from there herself.
Thank you for having me to speak on this press conference today. So I wanted to apologize because I might have to leave right after I deliver this statement, because unfortunately I have a presentation at another meeting. But I do want to share that for me, in my realm of work as climate envoy, and also as a poet and activist who've been active on climate change for a while, I've dealt with a lot of journalists who are featured in these headlines, these journalists who come and inundate our islands with questions and stories and documentaries, and usually they're after the same kind of narrative as my colleague here mentioned earlier, which is this climate exodus, this exodus of Marshallese people who are leaving in droves. How many people are leaving is always the question. Because of climate change, rather than are people leaving and what are they leaving for. And so for us in the Marshall Islands, most of us were pretty aware that this is a narrative which isn't accurate and which simplifies the reality of our situation. The impacts are real, and they're so real that in fact, just last week, the island was inundated with wave flooding and 200 people were displaced. And that was just last week, right before we had a meeting on our national adaptation plan, where we were discussing an adaptation plan that would help us elevate our island or even build artificial islands, because that's how serious the impacts of climate change have become for us. Where if we want to maintain our sovereignty and our own identity and our culture and our roots in our islands, that we're forced to actually change the entire physical landscape of our islands. And so, keeping that in mind, the realities are real and they are urgent, and they're not something that are far away and far off. And yet migration is not necessarily happening in the way that a lot of journalists are portraying. And so they are induced by climate-related factors, which I think is very new information for us in our community. That's actually very important knowledge for us, is that we understand we understand why we're leaving for education, for health, for work. But these other factors, drought especially, influencing people's moves, heat waves, influencing people's moves, we might not have made that connection ourselves to climate change directly. And so that is something that this report really emphasizes and helps us kind of encapsulate as we move forward in our conversations in these climate spaces. But I think what we want to emphasize is that we don't want to have to move, right? And I think that that's something that many of the Pacific Islanders and many atoll nations in particular are trying to emphasize. We shouldn't have to move. We want to be able to stay. And I think that the most important distinction here is choice. We should have the choice to stay or to leave. Migration is happening already, and it's not necessarily happening directly because of climate change, but we should be able to make that choice ourselves rather than being forced to leave as an entire nation. So I think that's a narrative that we want to convey, but also we want to convey that it's obviously very nuanced. This conversation is a very nuanced and complicated sort of situation, and I think the oversimplification of these migration narratives is one that needs to kind of be put to bed. I know that quite a few of those journalists are coming with very good intentions to the Marshall Islands, but I think this is something that we'd love the press to be a little bit more aware of as they're coming into our islands and seeking these storylines.
Thank you, Kathy. So, thank you, Keith. I would like now to open the floor for questions. Please just raise your hand, state your name, and identify the outlet you're working for so we can follow up. Please. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Megan Rowling. I'm a journalist at Thomson Reuters Foundation, and we've covered climate migration or pressures for climate migration for quite a long time. And we've followed the debates around adaptation and staying, and when you choose to go, etc. But I do wonder whether I'm just wondering, just in response to what Kathy was saying about the media. So, for example, in COP or the climate talks, we often are getting these alarm bell ringing messages coming from small islands, states, the politicians, the leaders. And as you say, the reality is a lot more complex and nuanced than that. How do you think, is it some of the fault lying with the politicians? I mean, on the one hand, they need to raise the game, put pressure on other countries to act so that your islands will not be inundated. And yet, so journalists hear this and then they respond to that. So all I'm saying is that maybe it's not just, there's politicians also playing a role in this too, and from SIDS too, I think, maybe. And so just interested to get your reaction from that. And on the research, Keith, did you have any sort of figures on how many people cited climate factors as as part of the reason why they left to go to the US? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Well, in regards to the the politicians in our region, I think that there's so much pressure on our politicians to bear the burden of climate change and representing our nation and fighting for survival, negotiating for our survival in these kinds of spaces. And I think it can be quite difficult to know what specific party line we're putting out there. And I think that that's why I really enjoyed being a poet, because poetry allows for a little bit more nuance and a little bit more space for these kinds of intricacies. But I do think that what we've been trying to convey as much as possible is urgency. And I think that if there's too much gray room in some of these statements that our leaders are giving, it might give leeway to being misused, to being manipulated. And so I wouldn't put too much burden or blame on them necessarily, just because there's already a lot that they're already having to hold on to. So I would just encourage that there be more conversations and more stories that allows for a little bit more of these nuances and gives these world leaders some room to share these nuances. Yeah, I hope that answers your question a little bit. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you also for your question about how many people actually cite climate-related factors as a reason to migrate. Within the Marshall Islands, there was less than 1%. So we interviewed 200 people in the Marshall Islands, and then 80 people in Hawaii and the Pacific Northwest in the US, which are key destination areas of migrants. And interestingly, the Marshallese who were already in the US had much higher levels of percentages of people citing climate-related factors, more around 30%. So we, within the team, we talked about it, and also in an information sharing workshop that we did in the Marshall Islands to talk with the participants about maybe possible explanations for that. And one of the things that was mentioned was that maybe also the people in the US, Marshallese people in the US, are a bit more exposed to media and maybe are more informed about climate change than the people in the Marshall Islands. So So there's, in the Marshall Islands, the public discourse around migration is simply like, yeah, we migrate for education, healthcare, work. That's it. So it's also like maybe climate change hasn't really come into the sort of public consciousness as a possible migration reason.
Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Monica from Cape Verde, but currently living in Madagascar. I'm co-founder of ecofeminism movement in Madagascar and in Cape Verde. My question is this: to what extent your research do a narrow analyze framework to relate to social problems? Because what we notice, especially in Madagascar, in my research group on integrating local knowledge into scientific knowledge, is that there are very social problems that is being arising due to the climate crisis. Thank you.
So thank you for your question. I think this focus on social problems wasn't really something we looked at into too much. But one thing, what came out strongly, we had this Q methodology, which is a new method for studying these things and people's views on migration, on climate change, etc. And what came out strongly there is that a lot of people, while they saw some of the benefits of migration, they also had quite nuanced views on what migration also did to social cohesion on their islands. So if a lot of people move, the things that they do to continue maintain cultural traditions are becoming more difficult because of migration. But maybe Kathy has more to say about this too.
Well, what it makes me think of is the U.S. tested over 60 nuclear weapons in our islands, and one of which was more powerful, 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. They evaporated some of our islands, and Bikini Atoll in particular is completely irradiated until today, and nobody can live there ever again. So when you ask how it might affect social, I'm thinking more future. So currently, you know, I don't see the real current effects right now that are very transparent to me, but I can see that in the future it's going to affect our cultural protocols. So for Bikini Islanders in particular, they were one of the strongest canoe builders in our islands, and they were not able to practice this tradition anymore because they couldn't be on their own island, and that's really affected them. Also, not being able to return to their homeland has affected their identity as a Marshallese people as well. And so I think that that's one thing that kind of comes up to mind when you ask about the social implications of loss of land and migration, is that we've already experienced that kind of grief and that kind of trauma, and I think that would probably intensify 1,000 times more, of course, because of climate change. And so that's what I'm kind of projecting into the future when I think of that.
Good day, Christopher Soderberg. I just reacted to what you just said. This identity. I've lived in 9 countries. I don't have a home. I'm at home in most places. I don't see that as a problem. But I think that one of the major problems in this whole climate debate is our disconnect from the planet. So that's something I'm trying to regain somehow, and what you just said makes me think that you have a contribution there to create an awareness for the importance of this connection to the earth that many people in our so-called modern, so-called developed society have lost. So if there's anything you would like to add on the importance of that connection to place and connection to the planet, that we could somehow, that could help us others to regain, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, it's a tall order for press conference, but it's a tough question to ask. But I think that what you said just now really resonates because it's a very common question that Marshallese people have received. Well, I guess I should say that's a question I've received before from a journalist where they said, you know, what would you say to people who don't understand connection to land and who would say, what does it matter if you lose that land? And I guess for non-Indigenous folks and people who might not have that connection, it's very difficult to understand that. But for us, almost every piece of land has a legend, a story, a song that's attached to it that's thousands of years old. And we have a very complicated land tenure system where almost all of us own land. I mean, every single Marshallese person owns a piece of land. And as you know, there's not much land. And so for us, land is value, land is fortune. And so that's why the adaptation, you know, the fact that we're having to adapt and rip apart our land to be able to stay in it, you know, elevating our land, that's gonna take ripping apart the land itself. That actually is incredibly horrible. It's very traumatic for the rest of us, but that's something that we're willing to do to maintain our sovereignty and to maintain our place in the ocean. And so I do believe that Indigenous people and so many communities like Indigenous folks have that connection to land, and there is so much lessons to be learned from those frontline communities. And so that's why it's so important that we're a part of these spaces. And I think that, yeah, they are leading the movement in a sense.
If I can add one thing to that, Kathy, you said it already, that a big difference is whether you migrate by choice or by force. So I also have lived more or less in 3 different countries, but it's my choice and I enjoy it. But if I would have been forced from the Netherlands to go and live in Spain, then I would have not been as happy. Well, all the other conditions would have been the same. Just by the fact that I was forced, the whole psychology changes, and it's much more difficult to make the best of your life when this movement has been forced upon you. So that's something which came out strongly also in the research, that people say, yes, we think migration is part of our lives already, but only if we can choose when, where, and how we migrate. And I think that's something that Kathy, you also really see from talking with your people.
Definitely, that's a human right.
Yeah.
So we have 3 more minutes for questions. Maybe someone else would like to ask something.
Thank you very much. I find your research so interesting, and I'm really happy that you continue doing this kind of field work, which I find it's really, really important nowadays to continue learning on this. My question is, if you have made a gender, if you have analyzed the answers depending on the gender of the person, and if you found any difference if the respondent was a woman, a man, or what, and if you could just say a little bit about that. Thank you.
As part of the research, I also already mentioned this Q methodology, and it's a way to extract sort of shared views within a certain population, right? And through the research, we identified 3 groups. The first group was the migration pessimists. The second group were the migration critics was the first group. The second group, the adaptation optimists. And the third group, the island pessimists. So we looked at gender there, and we saw that in the group of migration critics, the women were much less represented, and also young people were much less represented. So there is, and I think this is something we see also in other parts of the world, that a situation where young people are more open to seeing migration as an option. And I think maybe a hopeful finding was that the second group of adaptation optimists was also much more represented by younger people. So they do think that there's a solution for climate change on our islands without necessarily having to move.
Okay, I think if any of you have any further questions, we can keep it outside. We thank you all for being here, and please, if you have any questions for Dr. Shebarsky, the expert on sea level rise, just let me know. And well, thank you again, and we hope this was useful information for you.
Yo creo que lo trajeron un trocito y directamente sin estirarlo. Bueno, ¿no? Sí, claro, porque al final es que